Welcome to the St. Jerome's Center for Catholic Experience. Welcome to St. Jerome's University. My name is David Seljak, and I am the director of the center. No event in this year's series of lectures better captures our theme, From Hate to Love, Are There Pathways to Peace, than tonight's Teresa Deese lecture. The annual Teresa Deese Lecture was founded in 2001 by the Institute of the Blessed Virgin Mary, or more informally known as the Loreto Sisters. It was named in honor of Mother Mary Teresa Deese, who headed the first convent of the IBVM in North America. She was Superior General until her death in 1889. Mother Deese helped to establish a network of Loreto schools in Ontario and Illinois, and we know these institutions in Toronto, Hamilton, Stratford, and Guelph, which was the first Loreto school created in 1856, some 9 years before St. Jerome's University itself, by the way. Today, the Institute of the Blessed Virgin Mary is, to use the words of the Loreto sisters themselves, quote, an active community of Roman Catholic women seeking to spread the gospel as contemplatives in action. We would like to thank the Loreto sisters for their continued generosity to the St. Jerome's Center. Tonight's lecture also kicks off the 2004 Challenge for Change event, and we welcome the participants of that event here tonight. Challenge for Change is an ecumenical educational event sponsored by the Eastern Synod of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Canada and several other Christian churches and groups, including St. Jerome's University and the Social Awareness Office of the Diocese of Hamilton. This year's event, Building a Culture of Peace, continues tomorrow morning at St. Peter's Lutheran Church with a keynote address by Mary Jo Leddy, director of Toronto's Romero House and popular religious author. If you want more information on that event and would like to attend that lecture, by the way, Carol Person, the secretary of the center, has a registration form and other information at the back of this lecture hall. Tonight's lecture addresses a timely topic: understanding terrorists and martyrs, personal encounters with religious militants. And to address this topic, I would like to introduce to you my very good friend, Dr. Cynthia Mahmood, social anthropologist at Notre Dame University and senior fellow and director of graduate studies at the Joan B. Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies at Notre Dame. When I met Cynthia, or Dr. Mahmood, in Victoria as part of a team writing a book on religion and ethnicity in Canada, I asked her what kind of research she does. She said she interviewed Muslim combatants in Pakistan and Afghanistan, Sikh militants in India, and freedom fighters in Kasmir. I said, that's interesting. What I think I meant was, that's crazy. Isn't that a little dangerous? I asked. And the answer is, of course, yes. But talking to Cynthia, I learned that talking to religious militants is not as dangerous as ignoring them. Cynthia explained some of the reasons people choose to take up arms in the name of religion. She also explained with chilling foresight, I think, why the U.S.-led war on terror is swelling the ranks of such groups. Dr. Cynthia Mahmood received her MA and PhD in anthropology from Tulane University, New Orleans, Louisiana. She is the author of 3 books, the best known being Fighting for Faith and Nation, Dialogues with Sikh Militants. She is the director and editor of the University of Pennsylvania Press's Ethnography of Political Violence series. She is frequently featured on American television as a commentator on the aftermath of 9/11 and the war on terrorism, including apparently a very memorable visit to Bill Maher's Politically Incorrect. So you can see she has impeccable credentials. She has served as a consultant to the American, Canadian, and British government on religious conflict and is often called as an expert witness in court cases involving politico-religious violence. So I hope you will join me in giving a very warm welcome to Dr. Cynthia Mahmood.
Thanks very much. It's such an honor and privilege to be here with you tonight and to be introduced by my friend David Seljak. I'm very sorry to say that your wonderful Ontario weather has given me a sore throat, so you'll have to excuse me if I have to take some sips of water in between my remarks tonight. I've got to talk about some things that are a little more serious than just a sore throat. Before I came here to Ontario, I just came back from a trip to Eloy, Arizona, where I was providing expert testimony in a hearing related to terrorism. It was involving a young Sikh. Although the individual accused of membership in a terrorist organization lived in California, after he was picked up by police just a couple of weeks earlier, he was taken to Arizona, where he found himself in custody in a facility deep in the desert, nothing but cactus for miles and miles in any direction. It was in one of these new privatized jails, which I understand you also have in Canada. It was called the Corrections Corporation of America, the CCA. The courtroom where the hearing was to take place was inside the jail itself. So I couldn't have anything with me, no jewelry, no belt with a metal buckle. Couldn't have my prescription medicine with me, no pens, no paper, anything but the simple clothes on my back for the hearing. These kinds of circumstances for a courtroom are familiar to anyone who has visited jails and courts in other countries, but up until recently they've not been part of how we run our judicial systems here, which are supposed to be independent of corrections. But things have changed. Things have really changed in the United States since Homeland Security has taken over. And the Patriot Act has made sweeping changes in how risk is evaluated and how rights are protected or lost. A journalist was there. He was attempting to enter the courtroom to report on this hearing for his newspaper, but he was barred from entering entirely. Barbed wire surrounded the courtroom, of course. Nevertheless, I entered. I gave my testimony, the usual give and take of courtroom debate, and I was relieved. I thought democracy is safe in America, despite being surrounded by barbed wire and armed guards. In the actual event, the judge made the decision that this young Sikh in question posed no threat to American society or to United States national security, and he opted to release him on bond. So we all left the room and the building. We got our belongings from the lockers at the exit, passed back through security. But within an hour, before we had even reached civilization again, we were still in the van in the desert, we got a call on a cell phone, and we realized our mistake in assuming that the judge's decision would be the final one, because under the new regulations, the government has 24 hours to stay the decision. And in this case, that is what it chose to do. It chose to keep this individual in custody, despite the fact that the judge had decided he was, in fact, not a threat to the U.S. security. All that lawyers and the witnesses and the evidence and all the cross-examination had been for naught. The individual is thought to be too dangerous to release into American society. We learned that no one has yet successfully appealed this new, perhaps unconstitutional notion of a window during which judges' decisions may be simply overturned at will. Does it not emasculate the entire idea of an independent judiciary? But times are strange right now in the United States and in North America. We're frightened of our own shadows. In times of war, I heard one eminent justice say on CNN, the law is silent. I'm not sure quite which war it is we're talking about in Arizona, but I know that the idea of a silent or a silenced legal system is one that scares me to death. Countries where the law is silent are countries where people like me are thrown into cells and forgotten about, or worse. September 11th of 2001 has left a big wake in which we are still reeling, trying to find our proper courses. And at the same time, 2 years later, we're still celebrating the wake of the many who died that day, figuring out how to appropriately seek justice while grieving and honoring those lives that were horribly and abruptly ended. Unfortunately, history doesn't wait for the grieving to end before action must begin. Americans have been called upon to grieve and to act at the same time, as have people who found themselves in the midst of violence across all cultures and all times. Violence like that throws things out of kilter, it knocks people off balance, it tips worlds off their axes. And oddly enough, although we live in a very violent society, Americans have shown themselves to be strangely incapable of thinking realistically about violence. The perception that the attacks of 9/11 came upon us out of the blue, without any antecedent conditions, contributed to the rapid mythologization of these events. The world has changed, we kept saying. American assumptions of a pre-9/11 safety, tranquility, and peace, the implicit bastions of every empire at its height, are directly at issue as we stand today and analyze where we stand 2 years after that earthquake. The perception that that earthquake was sudden, the suddenness of those attacks, has led us to a certain kind of response rather than another kind of response. And the combination of our culture's concept of terrorism, which had already entered the realm of the mythic by the turn of the second millennium, with a radical misunderstanding of the significance of the events of September 11th, pushed the United States and its allies to a foreign policy posture that is exactly the opposite of what we in fact need to assure a safe and sane future. And it pushed many of us to put our own democracies at risk by legislating away our rights in the form of Patriot Acts and other features of what are proposed to be security. In my remarks today, I'd like to unpack a little bit further the concept of terrorism that stands at the heart of what we think about what happened in 2001 and what is happening as the United States and its allies confront radical challengers to Western hegemony around the globe. I'd like to use my own firsthand research with such radicals to consider alternate perspectives on militant violence and its global topography. And I'd also like to ask further a little bit more kind of personal question, even faith-based questions, about what kind of passions it is that motivates those radicals, and whether those passions have anything in common with the passions that motivate peacemakers, such as myself, and maybe such as many of you here. Josepa Zuleika and William Douglas, two anthropologists at the University of Nevada, in a provocative essay titled Terror and Taboo, have pointed out the historical similarities between the contemporary concept of terrorism and an earlier era's conception of witchcraft, as both undefined categories of evil that serve to rally society against persons asserting power from the margins. While provoking mass hysteria, neither category can be made readily operable as a tool for conflict resolution and the maintenance of social order. Another author, Michael Taussig, related the figure of the terrorist today to an earlier image of the wild man or the savage at the fringes of civilization, which scared our ancestors for several centuries into sacrificing money and children for fortifications, missionizations, and military campaigns as Europeans spread across the continents of North America and Australia. But those savages turned out eventually not to have, in fact, two heads or devilish tails, but to be mere humans like the rest of us. Today, in fact, we look back at their resistance and we think there was nobility in that resistance. Today's terrorists, suggest scholars like Michael Taussig and Bill Douglas and Josepa Zuleika, are viewed as no less outside the pale of humanity, unpredictable, unreasonable, unapproachable, something like the embodiment of evil or monstrousness that used to be embodied in concepts like witches or savages. We're scared to even approach them. One need not get into the legal minutiae of the terror and counterterror arena to recognize some key definitional problems at the heart of the concept. Even different governmental agencies in the United States and Canada have different definitions for the term terrorism. But subsequent to September 11th of 2001, Americans apparently heard the call to a war on terrorism as somewhat more definitive than those responsible for its operationalization can actually manage to put into effect. It's a call for a kind of war that is unlimited, both chronologically and geographically. It's a call to the choir for a permanent state of militarization against simply whoever would mobilize evil against us. I'm particularly well aware of the mythic rather than real quality of the concept of terrorism because, as an anthropologist, what I study is cultures of religious militancy. I do a kind of ethnography of terrorism, though I don't use that problematic term. Having spent a dozen years studying Khalistani Sikh militants, I'm particularly sensitive to the unreasoning fear evoked by kirpan-carrying Sikhs in some ignorant populations who suspect that one of them might, for some unknown reason, suddenly opt to leap out and take a swipe at a passerby. That's a fear of the unknown that's at play, not the fear of a knife, which, after all, everybody here has in their own kitchens. Greek Cypriot women I have interviewed have similarly mythic nightmares of Turks, I put that phrase in quotes, coming over the mountains with curved swords flashing, intent on rape and pillage. And there again, it's not the fear of further violence in Cyprus that is irrational. Unfortunately, conflict between Greeks and Turks might indeed break out on that island. But if the Turkish army ventures into southern Cyprus, it would be with tanks and fighter jets, not with long curved swords. The nightmares those women are having are based on myths, not reality. Nowhere is the idea of the terrorist as a mythic rather than human figure more apparent than in the almost universal assumption on the part of both academicians and policymakers that people engaged in this kind of violence are unapproachable. In the entire field of counterterrorism studies, there are only a handful of experts who've actually dealt with their subject matter directly. Those who purport to have inside knowledge of groups called terrorists usually means that they have read the publications of the group, or have followed the internet postings of the group, or they have gotten hold of the diary of a former member of the group. Not that they have actually taken the risks of the face-to-face, as Levinas would say, and actually talked to a terrorist. I've been on a panel in which a well-known terrorism expert held forth at length on the subject of a particular radical organization, not recognizing that the audience, a room this size, was filled with individuals who were members of that very organization. They were sitting in the front row. Studies of terrorism conducted by top government agencies in our countries begin with the assumption that it is only going to be factors observable from outside that can be used in predicting and presumably thwarting terrorist episodes. There's almost no other field I can think of that starts from the assumption that real knowledge of the subject is impossible or even undesirable. As a writer as eminent as Conor Cruz O'Brien maintained, fearing that understanding terrorism is tantamount to condoning it. This is an Alice in Wonderland world. It's based on a concept no one can clearly define, involving people nobody dares approach, but it's centering on life and death issues whose importance none of us dares ignore. I'd like to describe one episode in which an attempt of mine to break through the veils of assumed danger that inhibit any serious effort to understand presumed terrorists in custody came to naught. The man in question was being held in a high-security facility, and I could only see him after having signed all manner of releases and forms, ridding myself of all medals, so on and so forth. I was ushered by armed guards into a prison exercise yard, enclosed by concertina wire and monitored by sentries up in towers, aiming weapons down at us. The prisoner was escorted to my presence by similar armed guards who held him firmly away from me, about 3 meters away. We stared at each other across a glaring sunlit path. "Okay, now talk to him," one of the guards said. I looked from this prisoner. He was wearing one of those orange jumpsuits. His eyes were all red. His hair was flying everywhere. I looked at the guards. I looked up at the wire, the towers. All the sentries are looking down. All right, 3 meters between me and him. What kind of conversation is possible under these circumstances? The prisoner stood there looking at me skeptically, with good reason. So when I hear or read about interrogators at Guantanamo Bay and what they are or are not learning from presumed al-Qaeda detainees, I think back to this incident. And yet, if someone does break through the crushing presence of our don't touch ideology of terrorism, as if these persons represented a form of germ warfare in themselves that might contaminate us if we get too close, he or she faces all too ready accusations of complicity. It's a dangerous moment in our history. How can we find out unless we get close? But if we get close, we ourselves might be accused. In fact, part of the myth of the terrorist enemy is that he or she, and in this case it's actually virtually always a he, this is an interesting part of the myth, cannot be approached, cannot be infiltrated, or, I say advisedly, penetrated. This is, to be blunt, simply not true. It's not true. Anyone who works in parts of the world where al-Qaeda and its myriad affiliates function knows this to be a blatant falsehood, because these groups live, in fact, in relative security, relatively openly, that is, in many areas of the world. This is hard for Americans to admit because it would mean admitting the popularity of radical Islamic movements and their anti-Western ideologies. And it's also hard for us to admit because it would mean admitting at this point that the U.S. has not been effective thus far in prosecuting the war on terror. Nevertheless, it is true. I work in the Afghan-Pakistan border area where al-Qaeda, Taliban, and related persons today live and travel virtually freely, counting on support from the local population and from authorities who look the other way. After September 11th, I was among those scholars called upon to offer commentary on why they hate us. I work at a peace institute, so immediately we started convening seminars. We held conferences. We hosted speakers on the general topic of how Islam was a religion of peace and how we shouldn't blame all Muslims for what happened. Osama bin Laden had hijacked the religion, we cleverly said. Everybody jumped on this bandwagon because we were trying to avoid a national hate-mongering campaign directed at Muslims. But in the process, we made the actual 9/11 event look more and more puzzling and anomalous. We did pretty much succeed in averting the worst of any hate-mongering scenario in our countries. But the problem in our avoiding the responsibility of actually explaining what happened on 9/11 grew as it became apparent that this action, while certainly condemned across most of the world, including the Muslim world, was in fact applauded in certain sections of the world. And I think that we have to pay attention to which sections of the world applauded in 2001 and continue to applaud now the actions of Osama bin Laden and his comrades on 9/11. The entire focus of the academic discourse on whether Islam is or is not a religion of peace was a misplaced distraction from the real question that faced us in 2001. Residents of the Muslim world immediately asked why it was that in the aftermath of Timothy McVeigh's bombing of the Oklahoma City building, why we had not immediately convened seminars on whether Christianity was or was not a religion of peace. Instead of asking ourselves what were the grievances of these people that they saw fit to fly planes into the World Trade Center towers and into the Pentagon, instead of asking ourselves why they wrote notes explaining out of their humiliation what they were doing, explaining what their political motivations were, We seized upon those parts of their notes and their missives and their rhetoric that were the most exotic, i.e. the most Islamic, and chose to focus on those parts in our university seminars. Both are important. Both are clearly very important. But in the Muslim world, people noticed very clearly that we chose to exoticize the motives of those people, rather than to choose the parts that may make them less exotic to ourselves. Perhaps we don't want to admit that the motives of people who could do something as heinous as that may be anything like the motives that we ourselves might have, might even be on the same planetary plane as motives that we ourselves might have. And I fear that we in the world of academia and in religious studies have failed in our responsibility today as social and cultural critics in this pivotal moment in world history. As Salman Rushdie noted, ironically enough, the world of the intellect cannot remain, as he put it, inside the whale, that is to say, isolated from life, and still breathe the invigorating breath that sustains it. Nobody knows better than he the organic integration of the academy in society is not an untroubled location. It risks compromise as it approaches the corridors of power, and it risks alienation as it affirms independent postures. But scholars who are also moral beings are compelled to engage with their times. And I fear that many of us in the academy, though we believed we were engaging with our times, in fact have not dared to ask the real questions. Let me ask one now. Where is Osama bin Laden applauded? Where are Osama t-shirts being sold? Are they being sold at the, quote, fundamentalist heartlands of the Islamic world? Not necessarily. They are popular in the favelas of Rio, in the chawls of Mumbai, in the shanty towns of Johannesburg, and in the slums of Manila. Among the urban poor, a revolutionary hand gesture that made its way around the world in the year following the 9/11 attacks was raising two fingers as if in the V or peace salute, then abruptly folding them down. It meant the Twin Towers standing tall, then crumbling. And in the almost unbearably strange tit-for-tat dialogue between the powerful and the powerless over who has naming rights, that deck of cards containing the most wanted Iraqis was sold in other parts of the world as the most heroic warriors. In Act 2, a French satirist put out a deck of demons of the Bush administration, which is now being sold in a U.S. edition as a National Heroes deck. This claiming of the terrain and reclaiming of the terrain has gone global. Noticeably, it is not radical Islam or any sort of hijacked version of Islam or Iraq or Saddam Hussein at the heart of it. It is the U.S. itself which is the center point here. This is not surprising. After all, however dramatic his tactics, a millionaire in an Afghan cave will not remain the fulcrum of international attention and dialogue for long, nor will a two-bit dictator. But Osama bin Laden managed to open up wounds around the world surrounding relations of subaltern others with the United States. Too many people grieved for the 3,000 9/11 dead while secretly, somewhere inside, feeling pleased that somebody had managed to pull this off. It's very difficult, nearly impossible, in fact, to say this in the United States. But any honest assessment has to recognize it. Any American leader truly wanting to keep Americans safe will have to cope with this very widespread underlying feeling of resentment against the United States. That provides the important background to any further action, like the preemptive invasion of Iraq, or whatever other actions the United States may be planning in the future. It doesn't help us to put our heads in the sand and pretend that it doesn't exist. Although we often imagine that the attacks of September 11th were utterly irrational and inexplicable, Al-Qaeda actually released clear statements regarding the political intent behind them. There were three basic issues. One, that the U.S. should get its troops out of the Holy Land, that is Saudi Arabia. That there should be an end to the suffering of the people of Iraq, that is an end to sanctions. and 3, self-determination for Palestine. My point is not whether we agree or disagree. My point is, these are demands that are on the terrain of the political, potentially discussable and negotiable issues. They are on the continent of the rational, not the lunatic. It is true that there was much religious and apocalyptic rhetoric as well, but that too could be said of both sides. Both media and academics here focus nearly wholly on the Islamic element of bin Laden and al-Qaeda, but did not treat President Bush's rhetoric of crusading good and evil to the same sort of analysis. In some parts of the Islamic world, people heard local mullahs condemning bin Laden and the atrocities of 9/11 one day with full sincerity, but they heard them exhorting young boys to join the jihad the next day after hearing President Bush on CNN in his too hasty analysis of what had happened. There are some things about the origins of al-Qaeda that I think are important to emphasize or re-emphasize, because not everyone in our part of the world are entirely aware of the intellectual origins of this movement. We all know that the organization emerged during the anti-Soviet resistance in Afghanistan, but there's a context to that emergence that is also important. Al-Qaeda was founded by a Palestinian called Abdullah Azzam, who called his group the base Al-Qaeda because he saw it as an Islamic renaissance that would push back first the global hegemony of communism, then move on to push back the global hegemony of capitalism. It was at the start more of an intellectual and spiritual movement than a military one, focusing on a more humanistic answer to the world's problems than either the Soviet or the American superpower models could provide. Islam could offer, thought Abdullah Azzam, a potent third way through the end of millennium civilizational crisis. This notion of an Islamic renaissance, also referred to as an Islamic resurgence, sparked a rise of activism among young people in freshly decolonized areas of Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. Hubs of learning formed at key universities and religious centers, some of which Western policymakers now view as hotbeds of fundamentalism. An appellation which, in degrading their indigenous status, misapprehends their real significance. Osama bin Laden trained at one of those places, where he rubbed shoulders with young intellectuals from all over the world, who would later join his more militarized al-Qaeda as it developed in Pakistan and Afghanistan. Later, what happened with the militants of al-Qaeda as they spread out after the anti-Soviet war was that they merged with local movements of ethnic assertion and with anti-authoritarianism, as we now know, in the global web of what al-Qaeda became. One way of looking at the way this is viewed indigenously, and again, I want to caution that I do not mean to say whether this is positive or negative development. The way it's looked at indigenously, one way to look on this is some people from the indigenous side see this as wrapping up the last business of decolonization, that borders were drawn around countries, sometimes independent of ethnic groupings. Sometimes when European powers left, indigenous elites took over without regard to democracy or rights. Some of the groups which are now asserting ethnic self-determination or which are now asserting rights against those elites that took power when Europeans left are groups that are now allied with al-Qaeda. The individuals in those groups may or may not know or care other things about al-Qaeda and its ideology. They are linked in a kind of a cog-like way to the broader international organization. But many of them see themselves as part of a global era, apocalyptic in that sense, not in the religious sense, but in the sense of a history-making response, that they are responding on behalf of all of kind of the third world dispossessed peoples of the world against the hegemony of the West. I think we need to think about why it is that most people in North America don't know these very basic kind of intellectual facts about the history of al-Qaeda. And I think we need to reflect on what the cultural politics are here about our position as intellectuals in our society, that we remain largely unaware of it, while being hyper-aware of every military action undertaken by this group. Scholars of Islamic studies in the academy may know the names of key intellectuals in the Islamic world, such as Rashid Ghanouchi, Abdul Karim Sarouche, Mariam Jamila, and others. But inside the narrow academic niche of Islamic or Middle Eastern studies, these thinkers are not known. They are not studied, that is, as philosophical or political scholars in their own right, but they're studied as exemplars of an exotic tradition, not entirely coterminous with our own. Because of this artifact of the Western Academy, where Islamic thought today is concerned, we've let the society around us think that Islamic fundamentalists are anti-intellectual, when in fact perhaps what we've got is simply a non-Western and non-secular tradition that our not yet decolonized academy has grappled with. Another way of saying this is that our own academic arrogance has not let us help our society to actually perceive who our enemy is. Likewise, the fact that top al-Qaeda personnel have been arrested in Pakistan from the homes of Jamaat-e-Islamiyah leaders, with full complement of cell phones, laptop computers, and so on, is not recognized as illustrative of the continuum that exists there between extremist and mainstream Islamist organizations. So hasty have virtually all commentators been to point to al-Qaeda as an entirely marginal body that the normalcy with which it operates in places like Pakistan, its people among its supporters like fish in the sea, is unknown in the West. Were the true levels of sympathy for such extremism understood, we would have to be asking different sorts of questions than the ones we have debated thus far. I think that terrorism might be a less available label in our vocabulary, with less explanatory power. Treating Islamic militancy as an enigma is also problematic in terms of the progressive politics of many of us in the academy, who in this instance find themselves oddly in sync with the U.S. State Department. This congruity warrants more reflection than it has received. When we consider why the slum dwellers of Rio are treating Osama bin Laden like a latter-day Che Guevara, while virtually every American academic finds him or herself in agreement with Washington that bin Laden is a criminal or worse, some of them still being Che admirers, this is a circumstance to be pondered. The American left was able to bend itself round the notion of a liberatory role for religion in Latin America, but there's yet no similar conception of a liberatory Islam. Liberation Islam, as it is embraced in Muslim countries, passes as regressive fundamentalism when translated through our Orientalist academy. Our society stands frighteningly wholly against the enemy as currently defined, with very small dissident voices emanating from increasingly narrow spaces. The ethnographic reality of many Islamist fundamentalist movements is that they are drawing from the disempowered, disenfranchised, oppressed and repressed peoples of North Africa, the Middle East, West, South, and Southwest Asia, who have largely been excluded from power by the westernized elites who took over when white people left. The educated classes in these countries, whose kids are now agitating for human rights and joining progressive international organizations, look down on these people as regressive and right-wing. But the religious militants themselves perceive that they are the true anti-colonial radicals, as opposed to being pawns of the West who've given up their independent identities and souls for material goods. Bin Laden, a millionaire in a cave, expresses this proud stance perfectly. The left has somehow failed to see that where it has not succeeded internationally to grab the imagination of the poor, radicalized religion is succeeding, and succeeding spectacularly. One may think this is a good or a bad development, but it's simply there. For liberation theology in Latin America, the alliance between, or at least dialogue between, leftist, progressive, and religious causes is an accepted fact, but it's not so for the part of the world we think about now. The troubled terrain of fundamentalism studies in academia. What to make of an academic venue in which the ideology of a significant portion of the disempowered sections of the world is classed as substantially wrong, as a misunderstanding, that is, of its own tradition? Mahmoud Mamdani of Columbia University wrote an article called Good Muslim, Bad Muslim, in which he chastised Western scholars for their arrogance in setting themselves up as gatekeepers to the Islamic and other traditions in deciding which is the right kind and which is the wrong kind of Islam based on which is more or less dangerous to ourselves. What does this reflect about the political positioning of the academy in our global society of today? I know something about what real terrorists are like, real people involved in the lesser jihad of armed struggle are like. It's not as dramatic as you may think. Any real insurgency consists of a complex tapestry of motives and experiences that could never be reduced to any simple formula, like dying for virgins in paradise. Crazy. Let me tell you about some mujahideen in Kashmir. Some of them, first of all, many of them are young kids, don't even shave yet. Lots of them are young kids. It's true that people have come to join the jihad in Kashmir from all over the Islamic world. I volunteered in a field hospital for some time, and there were people there from Somalia and from Algeria and from Saudi Arabia, from all far afield. Some have come there out of a kind of a romantic sense of heroism. Some may have come out of some deep religious passion of fighting a jihad, but I can tell you those are a tiny, tiny minority. Some have been paid because they come from really poor countries and they need money, just like when you ask in a country like the United States why so many minorities are in our military, because they need 3 square meals a day and they can get a job. It's just like that. Lots of poor kids are in these jihads because they're getting paid. Lots of them are there because they have suffered some kind of tragedy or humiliation in their lives, and they blame it on their governments, and somehow their governments have been linked to, in this case, the Indian government, and they think that in fighting the Indian government they'll avenge that sense of wrong. And you know what happens once they start fighting? Just like what happens when our kids go into World War II or into Vietnam, or now in my country into Iraq. Thank God not your country. You know what happens? As soon as they get in their first battle and they see their buddy die, from then on all they're fighting for is to avenge their buddy's honor. And even before their buddy dies, you know what they're fighting for? They're standing up for the sake of their buddy so that they don't let their buddies down. And we know that's why soldiers fight in wars, and these kids are the same way. Let me briefly tell you about a kid named Yaqub. It's not his real name, but I'll call him Yaqub, as to why he's fighting there in Kashmir. And he's one of those guys we see on the news with big guns and scary-looking guys reading the Quran and all, you know. He joined that jihad in Kashmir, and he was trained by somebody related to Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. He didn't know anything about the ideology of any of that. He was from a small village in India. He had nothing to do with any politics. He's like 14 years old. One day, Indian troops, security forces, came to his village. They were looking for some kind of militants. But in the search, they managed to burn down his whole section of his neighborhood, burned his house, killed members of his family. They grabbed his elder sister. I'm going to tell you a horrible story, so mind your... They grabbed his elder sister and his grandfather, and they tied the sister to a post in the basement, and they tied the grandfather on the other side of the post, and young Yaqub happened not to be there. That's why he escaped this fate. And they tore the sister's clothes off, and this is a Muslim society where female honor is everything. They tore this girl's clothes off, and these security troops gang raped her in front of the grandfather. And the grandfather's having to witness this, okay? And finally they leave, and the grandfather managed to break free of his ropes and all, and he doesn't know what to do, and the girl is weeping, and she's ashamed, and, well, we may feel this is a horrible outcome, but he grabs an axe, and he says, I'm going to spare you this shame, and he hacks her to death, his own granddaughter, because to spare her the shame, and out of grief, he hacks the girl to death, and he says, I'm going to join now the Mujahideen. Out of his total grief, everyone's dead, the village is burned, and everything. He goes off, and he's an old man, and he says, I'm going to climb over the mountains, get training, and avenge my family's honor. Well, he doesn't know anything. He's not going to make it over the mountains. He's an old guy. But he runs into a group of some 34 youngsters who are off to join the Mujahideen. They say, Grandfather, where are you going? And he's struggling up the mountain, you know. He said, I'm going to join the Mujahideen, and they say, you're never going to make it. You let us fight for you. You go back, and, you let us fight. He says, okay. And these young 34, including Jakob, they go and join. Now, on the way, some of them get shot. There are encounters with security force. Some get killed. Some other ones, they freeze to death on the way. It's, the Himalayas. I mean, it's really cold. They freeze. And other ones fall off the cliff. Other ones die. Some get their limbs amputated. It's a very rugged climate. They get there. There's only a handful left, including our young Jakob, only 14 years old. He never fired a gun. He doesn't know anything about anything. But he finally gets there. And the weight of avenging his whole family, his village, all the rest of the 26 or whatever who died is now on his shoulders. And he's telling me, I'm going to go and die. And now notice he doesn't say, I'm going to fight. He says to me, I'm going to go and die to retrieve the honor of my family and my village. Now, why does he want to die for this? Well, because it's so far beyond words. Just as you're hearing it, you're feeling, oh my God, it's so far beyond words. We don't know what to do. He doesn't know what to do either, other than just throw himself down and die, which means some leader will use him in this way, okay? And then when I press further, he hopes that his passion in dying for this might inspire others. Someone might notice it in the world at large and see how people are suffering, He thinks he's going to do this. Does he know anything about the politics of any of this? No. He's reading from the Quran because he's memorized some verses and he hopes God will help him. Does he know anything about the theology? No, nothing. It's a pure, simple, he's been so humiliated. He's full of the indignity and he feels he must now avenge all of this. Now, we might find it comforting, right, to think about our terrorist enemy as a monster beyond the plane of human existence. But the fact that such a thing as an ethnography of terrorism is possible in itself negates the definition of our current terrorist enemy as non-human. Let me tell you about another, perhaps more meaningful encounter, because this was with an adult, not a kid. This is in the mountains of northern on the Afghan border, and I was with a group of people. And we're marching along this cliffside path, and I'm always the only woman, which I'll talk about in a minute. Hundreds of miles, they're all men, no women. And I've got my head covered, which I always do. And, excuse me a moment. And suddenly, the guy in front of me swings around, and he points his AK-47 at me, in fact, jabs me in the chest with it. And he suddenly shouts out, "We love Saddam Hussein, USA, no!" I'm just standing there, and I stand, and of course I'm totally unarmed, and I go without bulletproof nothing, which we'll talk in a minute why. There's a guy there, like a 16-year-old type of guy who's been assigned to kind of protect me, but thank God he doesn't do anything. He stands there. Everyone stands, silent. I don't know what to do, but I'm very calm at that moment. And I said to him, of all things, I said, as a wimp, I said, well, I'm critical of a lot of things about the United States, too. I said, well, maybe we could talk about it. And so he just stood there, we're all there. Suddenly he sits down cross-legged. He puts his gun down. Everyone waits a minute. They're looking around. They all sit down cross-legged. And I start saying, why do you support Saddam Hussein? Then he starts talking. We talk. Eventually, the other guys are listening. They all start talking. Someone starts boiling water for tea. They start passing tea. Then their watches start beeping. They've got these Saudi-made watches that beep when it's time for prayers, and it points the direction of Mecca, So they start doing their prayers, and I'm not a Muslim, but I bow down out of respect. I put my head down in the direction of Mecca and do the prayers, and then we get up, and I'm wearing a cross. So when we hear sometimes they hate Christians, and this is total falsehood. They respect Christians deeply. This is our ideology, not theirs. And so I'm wearing a cross, and now, they have a lot of respect for women. They never touch me. They never would touch a woman. But I'm wearing this cross, and the guy who'd had his gun in my chest, he reaches over, and he touches this cross on my neck. And I was totally shocked, but he touched the cross. So I took it as a recognition of my faith. So I kneeled down in our prayer gesture, and he kneeled down beside me. And slowly, one by one, all these guys kneeled.
Now, this is like a cinematic type of moment. And we don't want to read too much into it because it could have easily gone the other way. I could have gotten shot. I'm not a fool. I know what they're capable of and what serendipity can mean in these type of situations. But it also is a little bit of an indicator that there are spaces across which some type of recognition is possible. And we can think about how to magnify those spaces and not only magnify the spaces across which guns are pointed, which we are so adept at magnifying. So when we think about what we've got today as some kind of clash of civilizations, right? This is really an insidious failure of ours to recognize that the root of this problem is not a clash of our civilizations or our beliefs, no. But it's our inability to recognize the root of this problem in the growing domination of one civilization and its economic and political order over all others. And if you combine that with the purposeful blindness, if you combine that kind of purposeful blindness with the escalating mythology of terrorism, we're rapidly removing ourselves from the realm of the real. And I think it's important that although people accuse me of being an idealist, it's the opposite. I'm a gritty realist. People who think that we can protect ourselves against weapons of mass destruction, okay, maybe Saddam doesn't have them, but let's be realistic. This is an era where biological and chemical weapons sooner or later are going to be available to anybody. And it is not realistic to think that any amount of technological protection is actually going to save us from that. Our leaders say so because they want us to feel safe. They don't want panic in the streets. But the fact is that is not going to keep us safe. The only thing that will keep us safe is being able to understand the root of that problem and find a way to engage in dialogue. That's a false sense of security if it's going to be based on technology. Furthermore, if you approach those people, now I'm talking on the individual level, but we can extrapolate, I think. These are people who are tough guys. They're violent guys, okay? I think military leaders and military thinkers know that only about 2% of any population are actually natural-born killers who love to kill. I don't care whether it's Canadians, Americans, people in any country, anywhere around the world. People do not basically join these movements because they love to kill. It is hard to get people to learn to be soldiers. It's hard to get them to learn to be terrorists. That's the plain fact of the matter. People join these movements out of total desperation. Nobody wants peace more than they do. It's an actual fact. Okay? And realistically, if you approach them as a tough guy, even journalists go over there wearing bulletproof vests and helmets and with bodyguards. I'm not talking about military people. Journalists show up like that. They don't respond well to that. They're tougher than we are at any given point. What they respond well to is vulnerability. That's why I said I'd come back to why I go there. Just a woman, in their view, totally unarmed, basically naked, just myself. Because that's what will disarm them. That if we take that leap of faith, okay, actually a leap of faith and trust in the other, there's always that moment where they're a little shocked, like, whoa, what are you doing here? What am I doing showing up at their camp? Okay. But after that shock, typically they will reach out to protect me. I'm sure in that moment, if I had been there with a bodyguard, some American bodyguard with guns, that guy might have shot me. It's feminist scholars in anthropology and many related fields who have brought up this idea of vulnerability and humility in our scholarship as being an important counterweight to the kind of academics that evolved in the imperial era, when we went around the world with our militaries, kind of bludgeoning our way into studying other people's religions and cultures. We can't do that anymore. We found out about a type of Islam by doing that is not the lived Islam in people's minds and hearts. We have to go there with a different kind of humility in our hearts and in our intellects as well. And through that, as John Paul Lederach, a Mennonite peace builder, emphasized, he said, if we want to make peace, John Paul said, you can't do it the safe way, by engaging just in dialogue with moderates, with civil society. That's what we often do. We go talk to, so-called the moderate Muslims. Those are important, of course. We want to encourage people who are moderate. But after all, people who are moderates who come to talks like this and sit nice and quiet and, we're already all peaceful. We're not the problem in this world, okay? What you need to be able to do is engage in dialogue with the people with guns, okay? And it's not enough to say, okay, well, if we encourage moderates, those extremists will kind of fade away. And if they don't fade away, we'll send the CIA to get them. First of all, they don't fade away. Why don't they fade? Because their grievances are real and there's a population that supports them, like it or not. Secondly, even if there's only a few of them left in this age of weapons of mass destruction, a few can be really dangerous. So therefore, we are going to need a leap of faith and a leap of great courage as peacemakers to go on ahead beyond the moderates. And as one FARC guerrilla in Colombia told John Paul, don't build a bridge by starting in the middle. You're going to have to build a bridge by starting on the ends. And one of them said to John Paul once, you and I have something in common. He said, what? Because we don't think we have anything in common with people like that. And they said, well, I'm a person of great passion. That's why I'm fighting for this cause. And they told John Paul, and you are too. That's why you're out here making peace instead of sitting home in your middle-class suburb watching TV. And I think that actually there's something to that. That there's a reason why people like us come and worry on whatever evening we're on, Thursday, cold night. We come out and worry about stuff like peacemaking. And other people are out there, and we may agree or not. We certainly disagree with their tactics. But other people are trying to rise to what they see as their occasion as we're trying to rise to ours. We have something in common. We have some passions there in common. That we can find some ways to build bridges with those people. It may demand some unconventional knocking on doors of governments, as I try to do, showing up in courtrooms and giving testimony where you may not be wanted, going up some mountains in Pakistan and talking to some unsavory characters. But I think it's time for the citizenry to go on ahead and do some unconventional things to make sure that if our leaders won't take us to a truly safe and sane future, we will go on ahead and ensure it ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you for your response. Dr. Mahmood is willing to take some questions. There are many of us, so I ask you to keep your questions brief and to the point, and please not to make statements and speeches. That's for professors and boring people. If you'll put your hand up, Ivan has a microphone. He'll ask you to hold it very close to your chin and speak very clearly so that we might all hear you. So we have some questions up here.
Thank you. Doctor, in a society that we're in this particular audience,
Yes. I think it's important not just for Canadians, but for everybody to protect civil liberties at home. That's a critical thing that everybody has to stand up and do all the time. Another thing that's very important for Canada, and that's why I have become increasingly involved in Canada, not every country in the Western world, as you well know, has to do exactly as the United States does. And it's very important that, each country follow its own moral path to show people in other parts of the world that there isn't just a single Western capitalist hegemony going on here. That there are ways to, for example, join some parts of the war on terror without joining the preemptive invasion of Iraq. There are some ways to pick a Canadian path. And I know that sometimes I've been in Ottawa and some other places, and I've been asked, well, do people in caves in Afghanistan really know the difference between Canada and America, or would they just as likely bomb Ottawa as Washington? No, they know the difference. They know the difference. They're not this blind, They're intellectual enough to understand the differences among these things. So I think that it's really important that Canadians be world citizens, but also careful Canadian citizens in the world right now. Because there has become this sort of growing, clash going on, coming from our side, and we want to be careful to show others that we're not a single hegemonic bloc. I think that's a very important thing. Another important thing to do is within Canada, here we have this wonderful multicultural and multi-religious mosaic, and you can reach out in every way to people of other faith communities and within your own community here who have ties all over the world. And those ties are instantaneous. And you may think it's a small gesture, to do a kind deed or to go to a mosque or to go to a Sikh Gurdwara. Just go, even if you're scared or never been, just show up one day. Because in fact, you'll be warmly received, and before you know it, the word gets passed around. Just show up one day. Just go ahead and do it.
I'm very interested your passion and your love, what you spread around. But I think we need education about that love is the opposite of fear.
Yes.
So, what can you tell about that?
It's funny. I maybe this is too personal, but I'll share it. That I was brought up Mennonite in Pennsylvania, and I kind of moved away from that as I grew older. And when I started, I don't always say I'm a religious person, but I kind of have become a person of faith in a funny way, because when I started doing this work, I realized that the more I was fearless, the more I was also filled with a strange kind of love that really I have to experience as grace. And in that moment that I just told you, when that guy turned around and pointed his gun at me, maybe it won't sound strange in this audience to say it, but I really was filled with a kind of a love for this person. And I was totally unafraid when I sat and talked with him. And, I don't know if you call it grace or what you call it, but anyway, that episode ended well. And I think the more you push the envelope of your fear may be a small thing, like standing up and speaking to a group, or saying things that for me in the United States are a little difficult to say because I'm kind of worried who's listening, and or it may be climbing a mountain, and whatever. If you just push the envelope a little, you get sort of more and more fearless. And to me, I have been finding that's why, though I'm not formerly religious, I've been saying now I've become a person of faith because I find myself suffused by that kind of love and grace. The more I dare to just go on ahead and reach out like that.
You said at one point these people have genuine grievances,
yes,
which is why they join these things, which I'm sure is true. What I'm wondering is, in response to that, apart from the things you said about reaching out,
yeah,
are those grievances primarily internal to these jurisdictions, and the best we can do is sort of sit back and hope they work out okay? Or are the grievances they have primarily the fault of our Western society, for lack of a better word?
Well, let me give you a couple of different examples. I'll start with one. I've been talking about Muslims, but I see there are some Sikh brothers and sisters here, so I'll start with Sikhs. Look, Sikhs in Punjab have suffered all kinds of horrific human rights abuses over the past 20 years. It has nothing to do with the U.S. or Canada. It has to do with India. Now, this is not us. This is not our fault. It's the fault of conditions in India. Nevertheless, is there something we could do to help in that situation? Well, certainly there is. We could get involved and publicize that and use the international forum to try to bring India to account for what it has done to the Sikhs. Now, were some of the Sikhs wrong to take up arms and use those to kill innocent people? Well, certainly. They may have been justified in taking up arms according to their own theology, according to some kinds of international law. Certainly, most of us would say they were wrong if they committed atrocities against innocent people. What's the current situation is a lot of those who were involved in that armed insurgency think that the violence led nowhere. They're trying to now think through, what can we do to assert our rights in Punjab because this violence didn't work out. They're looking for new ways. And some of us can help them. For example, I can through education. Through encouraging some of them to come, as I am now, to our graduate program to learn about other ways of asserting rights. Okay? Now, there's a case where it has nothing to do with the U.S. or Canada. It's something internal to India. But if we want to prevent armed violence like that which beset Punjab, we can help out in publicizing human rights abuses, even though they had nothing to do with us. If you take another case like Palestine and Israel, in the case of the United States, obviously that's very deeply entangled with the United States and its policies toward Israel. Of course, there are many complicated issues within the U.S. about what we should do about it, but that's very much entangled with the United States and its own foreign policy.
The question I have deals with, it seems like a lot of these countries are really groping and searching for modernity,
yes,
or democracy, and proper judicial mechanisms. Because some of these atrocities that you're talking about being internal, I mean, theoretically, we wouldn't see those things happening where you have democracy and where you have proper judicial. Is this
yes,
reasonable observation?
Well, I think so, and yet we can't impose democracy from outside. So, that's why I've been a firm critic of the U.S. idea about Iraq from the beginning. I mean, even were we successful, which was unlikely from the beginning, this is not something that you can impose from outside. This is something that has to grow from within. And unfortunately, we don't know. I mean, our policymakers don't understand enough about different forms of democracy to understand the many variants that appropriate democracy can take. For example, Iran. Iran is now struggling to find some kind of Islamic democracy. And yet, in the United States, all we can see is the capital I Islamic part of that. and not the fact that it is one of the few Islamic countries that right now is struggling to evolve some kind of democracy. So I think you're absolutely right, but the trick is we can't impose our type. We have to find a way to encourage those countries who are struggling to evolve their own types of democracies. And so far, it's been very hard to do this. Let me just give one word of praise to Canada, and it's not because I'm standing here. The Canadian government has been among the most open in the world to welcoming experts and scholars and others from other fields like anthropology, my own field, to offer insights about other cultures and other religions. It has been way ahead of the United States, the United Kingdom, many other countries in recognizing this fact. So I think, you can be proud of that Canada is trying to do this, to try to understand the cultural nuance of what these things mean. It won't all be like it is in the West. And if we shove democracy down their throats, and if we shove Western feminism down their throats, by the way, we will provoke way more resistance. I can tell you, let me tell you something about Kabul right now. Western feminism was unfortunately used as a post hoc justification for military intervention. Some of these women in Kabul are now without burqa, but most of the people in Afghanistan, most of the women wore burqa before. They're wearing burqa now. The most stable building right now in Kabul, do you know what it is since we went there and spiffed up the place? It's a beauty school, a cosmetological college. They need hospitals, they need schools. But one of the things they've got now is a beauty college, because we think it's part of liberation to, learn how to do your hair and your face. Look, in Afghanistan, I'll just give you my personal bandwagon here, but in many of these countries, the biggest women's issue is poverty, because kids are dying. Frankly, it's not whether they've got their head covered or not. They're worried about getting food on their table. Their husbands beat them before, they beat them now. They get raped on the streets before, they get raped on the streets now. They're worried about poverty, and that's why they support various kinds of militias, some of whom are against us, because of extreme economic inequality.
There's a woman in the back there. There seems to be a hormone in males that this allows them from asking directions,
Okay, yeah.
but prompts them to monopolize the question.
I have kind of a two-portion question. Number one is, do you have any inside information as to the status of the prisoners in Guantanamo in Cuba, as far as civil rights or lawyers going in and helping them to get freed up?
No.
And number two would be, do you suffer any backlash because you are outspoken as per the U.S. government's status in with regard to the Iraq War invasion?
No, I don't know about Guantanamo, and I don't want to comment on it. And about the U.S., the suffering in the U.S., no, not yet. I fear it all the time, but I don't suffer from it. I've suffered in other ways in other parts of the world, but not... and I've suffered, let me say this, I've suffered in academia because of my views. We all pride ourselves, we are so liberal and progressive. No, it's academics who are conservative. No, the court system is happy to recognize the government, different government departments, the military, the secret services, they know that you need to be intimate and close to the people who count to know about them. Top people in the military don't misunderstand what terrorism is about. It's political ideologues. People in the military and in the secret services, they deal with life and death stuff all the time. They have to know what's going on. it's people in academics, I'm sorry to say, who are among the most conservative group when it comes to this sort of thing. But I'm sorry to say I don't know or don't want to comment about Guantanamo.
You'll be happy to know that you can say whatever you want here, as Rick Mercer has shown. Anything that happens in Canada never gets reported in the United States.
Ever since 9/11.
Yeah. Yes. No.
There's so many of them, and the media are no help at all except for here and there, like those black on the internet.
Yes, that's right. Look, the Bhopal disaster happened at about the same time as the Tiananmen massacre in Beijing, right? Happened about the same time as the massacre of Sikhs in Punjab and northern India. And I think we need to ask why the media and our governments emphasize one thing and not others. I mean, obviously, we all know about Tiananmen. Still now we commemorate it every year with parades and so on, because, that had something to do with communism. But if it has to do with industry and capitalism, or if it has to do with the largest democracy in the world repressing a religious minority, we don't want to know. So I welcome you to publicize it further.
Yeah, I very much like your story about the kind of close feeling of the person then sitting down and solving the problem, and really feeling love with that kind of person and being able to communicate. But are there ever any times where you don't feel the ability to breach that, and you just feel so frustrated that you're not able to communicate at that level?
Yeah.
And so what do you do if someone points a gun and says something ignorant, and how do you breach that?
Yeah, that's good to ask that too. Like, there was one guy who he set off a bomb in a neighborhood and it killed a lot of innocent people, and not only that, he used kids in setting off this bomb as the kind of go-betweens. And I hated him. I mean, I couldn't stand him. I couldn't, and he had suffered. He had been tortured and everything. And other people were sitting around. And moreover, he told the story with pride. He didn't even say, like, I regret it or any, he told it with pride. And I just said, like, I didn't say, how could you have done that? But I just sat there and I said to everyone around him, do you think that guy was right? And everyone said, no, that was terrible. He shouldn't have done it. I said, well, why don't you condemn him? Why don't you tell him? I said to everyone around, why don't you tell him that what he did was terrible? And the other guys said, well, we can't, because he suffered a lot and he was a hero and it took a lot of courage. And I just got up and left.
Just briefly elaborate on the theme that you had, that we cannot impose, whether it's democracy or our immoral standards across the world.
Yes.
U.S. immorality.
U.S. immorality, did you say?
Yes, I had
Well, Look, whether it's morality or immorality, the problem is imperialism. You know, we're still in an imperial mode. It might not be the same one that our grandparents were in, you know, but we're still in that kind of a world, intellectually and morally as well, you know. And that's why I say what's called for is kind of a little bit of humility here. And when we place, right now I think it's in the sphere of religion that it's really called for, because we somehow think that other people's religions, which we're way too ready to call fundamentalist, or look for their motives in some obscure passage of their holy book, you know, when we would never look for our motives in some obscure passage of the Bible. It's other people's religion. That's where it's called upon, to walk in the other person's moccasins. You know, understand it as lived religion. Now, should you read the Quran to understand? Well, sure, you can read the Quran. That's great. You know, of course, it's a wonderful scripture. You know, but when I say don't impose morality or immorality, imperialism is the problem. If we think that we have found the greatest way of life on earth, you know, this is crazy. Other people have found wonderful ways of living that they dearly love and want to maintain. And that's why the gentleman in the back, I agreed with you about democracy, but I would not use the word modernization. Those people are not living in medieval times. You know, they're fully modern. They've got wristwatches that beep and tell them what time to pray and what time to bow to Mecca, and Osama bin Laden is an engineer. They're modern, but they don't choose our modernity that leads us to divorce rates and taking depressive medications. I'm not saying this because I celebrate their lifestyle. I'm saying it as an anthropologist because I know that every culture is ethnocentric. And as long as we say that they're somehow stuck in the Stone Age or in medieval times and we need to help them modernize, you know, we're just as bad as our grandparents who tried to colonize them and lift them up somehow. They don't want that patronizing attitude. And they'll just respond with a gun if we try to shove it down their throats.
Since early 1985, I have been involved helping locally and internationally the victims of inhumanity on Tuesday will be 29 countries. Mm-hmm. And so I understand terrorism against a society and individually, more the individual, the clan, the tribe. Within the past 3 days, I've been trying to save the life of a pastor and painter in Cape Town, South Africa, and a father in Harare, Zimbabwe. That's the truth. Now, in a few days, there's going to be a campaign or rally in Fort Benning, Georgia, at the School of the Americas, name change, but that's their material, also referred to as the School of the Assassins.
Yes.
Thousands of Americans, some Canadians will be there, and this is a place where they have trained for years soldiers, mainly from South and Central America, in military matters. Some of the courses are questionable, and some of these people have been involved in killing sisters, priests, Oscar Romero, in El Salvador. And just lately, reports indicate that the drug cartels have employed soldiers, some of them having been trained at the School of the Assassins in Fort Benning, Georgia. Do you have any knowledge about that school?
Well, I agree with everything you said. That's what the School of the Americas is. And not enough Americans understand what that is.
You said that it was important to create dialogue with groups like this. Do you feel that it would be a way to solve any of the problems? If you do you see Western cultures adopting this form of conflict resolution? And do you think it would work? Why or why not?
Look, I'm not actually a total pacifist. I mean, I grew up Mennonite, but I'm not a total pacifist. I think that sometimes force is necessary, whether by a revolutionary group. I mean, even the UN Declaration on Human Rights starts out by saying, where rights are not protected, people may be compelled to rebel. I think I would never want to deny recourse to arms on the part of weak and powerless groups who have tried every other means at their disposal. And likewise, I think I'd be unrealistic to say that in our nations, sometimes force is not necessary to protect us. But the point is, it has become the first recourse. And many other nations and groups around the world would think very differently about us were it not the first, but the 10th or the 100th recourse. And what we saw in the case of the war on terror was that immediately after 9/11, it was the absolute first response, despite the fact that we say it was not the first response, because of the ideology of we don't negotiate with terrorists. In fact, they cannot be negotiated with. They're beyond the plane of negotiation. They're monsters. They're off the plane of the earth. Okay. We cannot, we do not, we will not. Because of that ideology, right? There is no option but war, which I believe will become total world war, because of the nature of how we define the enemy. Undefined geographically, undefined chronologically. The enemy is whoever is evil enough to be against us. Okay. And we have superpower weapons, and they will either do or will have superpower weapons. Right. So it cannot be the first recourse. Okay. And even at the time I tried, others tried through our own backdoor means to find ways to say, let's first call up and try to have a dialogue with Mullah Omar or with Osama bin Laden. But because of the pervasiveness of our ideology, we can't even begin to. Okay. I spoke in New York right after 9/11, which was a tough crowd, believe me. And, of course, people there had suffered and, they had just lost loved ones. And, people were saying, you can't be telling us not to do anything. You can't be telling us. We've got to do something. Of course, they all said. And one of them was a lawyer, and my colleague said, you're a lawyer, aren't you? He said, yes. And he said, well, if somebody is murdered, do you put a gun in the hands of the murdered person's family because they're so angry and they've got to do something, and you say, go on ahead, do something? He said, well, of course not. We leave it to cooler heads. That's how our mature civilization has evolved, And yet, in the case of 9/11, that's exactly what we did. We left it in the hands of those who had suffered, the U.S., to go on ahead and in a moment of anger, take it out on the world. Well, we haven't yet reached this level of maturity where in the international system we do exactly what we do in our domestic courts, which is let cooler heads prevail. Bring it to an international court of justice. And I think as to what we can all do, that's one of the things we can do. Work on International Court of Justice, the World Court in The Hague, reforming the UN system. Because in the end, this is going to be the only way that we're going to resolve these things. In the end, that lawyer kind of sat down and he said, well, you're right, but still I'm so angry. Well, yeah, we are. We're so angry. Just like that poor kid in Kashmir, he wants to throw himself into a hail of bullets. Well, we're not 14-year-old kids. No, we know better than to do that. And if that young lawyer wants us as a country to throw ourselves into a hail of bullets, let us restrain him from doing that.
magazine that there's like 29 conflicts going on around the world. And I can understand why you focus on why do you focus
That's only my own academic interest. It has nothing to do with, look, that's my own, as a scholar, that's one of my research specializations. But I'm glad you brought this up about how many conflicts there are around the world, because it helps us put September 11th in perspective. You know, in the United States, I mean, I don't hardly dare say this. Are there bugs in the room or what? I mean, look, frankly, this was horrific, but it's a flea bite. 3,000 people is a flea bite compared to Rwanda. Places in Africa where that many people were getting killed every day. We don't give a damn about those people getting killed every day. People are dying of starvation every day by that number. Nobody gives a damn about that in America. You know, we dare not say such a thing, of course. No, we magnify this out of all proportion, not to proportion to America or to the horror of the people who died, but out of proportion to the global reality of human suffering. No. So you're right to bring that up in the context of global conflict and global casualties. You know, I emphasize what I emphasize because we're sitting here in the U.S. and Canada where these are our immediate issues. But in terms of actual global suffering, you know. Now I see it's almost time to go, so I want to end on one other note because somebody 2 days ago in Toronto asked me, how do you keep up your spirits and not get depressed? You know, talking about worrying about violence and people whose sisters were butchered and everything all the time. And what I told that person was that when you're actually working with people in wars, those people are rarely spiritless and depressed. You know, they're actually full of life and hope and strength. It's us sitting here in our middle-class houses watching TV every night who get depressed. It's not the people who are in the middle of wars. Those people somehow find strength and courage. And I kind of want to leave you with that thought because it's kind of part of the way that we're spoiled. How dare we have the right to say we're depressed, you know? We should be out there like fighting with them to make this world a better place because they're not depressed. We're very spoiled if we sit around saying how depressed it is to look around and see the violence in the world. So I'd like to end with that, but I really welcome anybody. I'd love to talk with anyone who wants to talk further. I'm outside afterward.